Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me for another Alfred Hitchcock Presents review. Today I'll be talking about Season 3, Episode 7, Enough Rope for Two, starring Gene Hagen as Madge, Stephen Hill as Joe, and Steve Brodie as Maxie. And this is just an average episode, in my opinion. It's one of those episodes that's just kind of there. The episode is solid enough in its plotting and directing. The acting's fine too, but it's one of those episodes that I feel tries to have more depth than it really does, and I just thought the ending was kind of strange and wasn't really all that effective either. It's also pretty predictable, but it's a watchable, acceptable opinion of the show, in my opinion. So we start with two of our main characters, Madge and Maxie, and they're talking about a third man named Joe. They're all our main characters, and it turns out that Joe's going to be released from prison. He's been in there for like 10 years, I think. We also learn that Maxie's the one that turned Joe in, and that Madge is also in on this whole thing, although they're not sure if Joe knows that or not. So, kind of a complex triangle, I guess is a good way to say it. So, at this point, Joe comes back home to see Madge, and they talk, and you can tell it's a little bit awkward, the whole situation, which I thought was portrayed well here. And Madge kisses him, and at this point, she says she's going out and the real reason is because she needs to use the phone to get in touch with Maxie. So they're definitely in on this thing together. It turns out that they're trying to find some money that Joe hid away that they can't find. So at this point, Maxie just happens to come by. At least that's what he says, even though we know different. And he brings up the money right away. He's definitely not too subtle. And he says we can't find it. And Joe says that's because he hid it in the desert in case something went wrong. He had an alternate plan. And once again, there's a lot of tension in the room between these characters. So Maxie says he's entitled to half the money, which was the deal. But Joe said because he's the one that did all the time, that Maxie's cut is going to be smaller. I think he wants to give him like $25,000. I think the total is like $100,000. So still a decent amount of money. They argue about the expenses for this trip out into the desert, and you can just tell from here and being Alfred Hitchcock Presents that things are not going to go too well. So at this point, we start getting Madge's thoughts and little brief segments. There was one earlier in the episode as well. I actually thought these were odd and didn't really add a lot to the episode. I get what they're going for. They're trying to get us more into the character of Madge, but these thoughts, in my opinion, didn't really add much in this case. So at this point, they stop for supplies. They buy a shovel and a rope. It turns out that this money is down in some mine shaft. Probably not the smartest place to hide it, as we'll find out. And at this point, Joe also buys a gun. Maxie sees this through the window, and he tells Madge, he warns her that Joe must know that we're in this thing together. And I have to say that none of these three characters are the smartest Alfred Hitchcock Presents characters, in my opinion. So they're driving through the desert for a while. It's definitely a pretty deserted area. And they arrive at this destination, this mine shaft, and Joe immediately pulls the gun. After, a few seconds, he shoots Maxie. He also hits the water canteen, which probably wasn't good. At this point, he hits Madge and confronts her about the whole thing. Joe's definitely not the nicest person either. To be fair, Madge isn't exactly totally innocent here. So at this point, he tells Madge, you're going to use the rope to help me get down and I'll get the money. Now, why Joe would leave Madge up there by herself and think she would just go along with this, I have no idea. You just got to kind of go with it. So at this point, he finds the money and Madge starts to pull him up, but she starts having those thoughts to herself again. And she decides she's going to cut the rope and basically take the money for herself because she's already pulled the money up. But it turns out there's no keys in the vehicle that they're using. Probably would have been a good idea to check on this if you're Madge before you had this plan. I'm just saying, kind of another bad character moment here. This episode's full of them. So at this point, Joe says he broke his leg because the rope snapped, even though we know Madge cut it. And then Joe comes to the conclusion after, I guess, he figures out that Madge cut the rope. This was a little bit confusing, but he kind of decides that he's going to stay in the mine and let himself pass away there rather than let Madge have the money with someone else. So basically, he leaves Madge in the desert, and she basically has no water or anything. So I guess things don't turn out well for her either. So it was kind of predictable that the ending of this episode, where all the characters would kind of end up in a bad situation and get what's coming to them, I guess you could say. But the end of the episode seems like it wants to have more depth and psychology behind it than it earns, in my opinion. Still, the acting and the plotting are pretty solid overall in this episode, and it's watchable. There's just a lot of strange plot points in this episode, in my opinion. And it's one of those episodes where characters do things that they need to do just to advance the plot. So I'm going to give Enough Rope for Two a 2.5 out of 5. Just an average episode, in my opinion. I would say you could watch this one or not. Opinions may vary on it. I thought it was average. So 2.5 out of 5 for Enough Rope for Two. And as always, thank you very much for watching.